panel speaker. Before we do the panel, I'm going to introduce Ben Tatta, who's the co-founder and president of a company called 605. And just going to the landing page of their website, they describe themselves as helping some of the world's biggest brands to find their target audiences and measure the results. And Ben's going to talk to us about new age data, how refresh metrics and techniques are boosting advertising effectiveness. Ben.
Thank you. Thanks to Rick. I could really go for a Corona right about now. I should do a show of hands to see who else would like to join me. We got one taker here. First, I just want to thank Justin and team for having us. This is just such a great event. And even though we come with kind of a US perspective, it's really interesting to see the context of what's happening in the United States, reflected against everything that's happening around the world. And I think one thing is very clear. There is a big shift happening. 605 was founded on a simple principle that TV measurement is broken. Sample-based approaches are inadequate in measuring an audience that's fragmented across the dial, fragmented across device, and most importantly, is not necessarily the true measure of the value of the medium. And as a result of a lot of the work that we had experienced at Cablevision working with census level data, we really saw how census level data could be applied to not only measure things on a more granular basis, but to measure the effect of advertising, whether it related to the cash register sales or brand attribution, brand perception. I think what we're hearing, what's really interesting about the dialogue is that there's a discussion about data in a very focused way. It relates to media optimization rather than creative optimization. And it also talks about it in silos. And I think what we really need to do is fuse the data together. The benefit, I think, of the position that we're all in today is that there is a shift happening. We knew that there would be a migration to census-based data, but what's happened this year and the rate of change is more dramatic than the last 10 years that we've been kind of studying the space. I ripped a few headlines just from this year. And as all of you know, both the buy side and the sell side are really migrating away from the legacy currency. And whether it relates to replacing the currency, I think this is less about replacing the currency and really about adopting and adapting to new data sets that can provide more granular measurement of the value of television. We all know it works, but we've done a really bad job at measuring the value. And I think the new data sets can do that. I also pulled a quote from an analyst that kind of did an over-the-top projection that this migration to more granular audience-based targeting represents about $100 billion of incremental value. I don't know if it's $100 billion, but it's definitely in the billions of dollars. And we talk about the demise of TV, and the fear of Facebook and Google. And I think TV's only problem is measurement. The TV platform is more effective and it drives everything that's happening on all other platforms, and only until we can measure it discretely would be able to prove that out. But it was really great to see a lot of the movement, and I think what we're seeing in the States is really just an early indication of what will happen in other markets around the world, where the largest sellers of media, namely the programmers, are really organizing around better measurement and what we could do. And I think some are focused more on the currency and some are focused more on just measurement and attribution. I think regardless of what happens with the currency, it doesn't mean you shouldn't leverage new data to measure and optimize. So, I don't want to be redundant with some of the trends, but what's happening, because there is this demand for and the shift towards audience-based selling, it's generating a tremendous amount of demand for census-level data, for more advanced data sets. Our company was founded as an independent entity specifically so that we could work with multiple operators in onboarding the data. We tried to, regardless of what we did at Cablevision, at the end of the day, we couldn't grade our own homework and have that stand up. So having an independent entity to help foster kind of multi-MVPD collaboration was kind of essential. And that's good news because I think the MVPDs are in a much better position now to leverage data for their own benefit, but also for the benefit of the programmers. And not to discount OTT data, without a doubt, given the changing consumption patterns, pay TV device level data or set-top box data is really just the start. Being able to extend that across any device on the network is going to be really essential. So how does this relate back to the topic, the new age of metrics? I don't know if it's a new age of metrics. I do know that there are a lot of new emerging data attributes that are available today that are interesting, but I think they really are just slight variations of what we always had. So whether it's an audience index, which basically is kind of an audience ranker of the top network shows or day parts against a custom target audience. So I'm Chase and I want to market to gold customers with a certain financial makeup and those that might have a competitive card. You could never do that, in an age and gender-based approach. Being able to overlay that data onto the viewership data and rank networks and day parts to generate a media schedule or a linear plan is really the basic approach. And that's, I think, the first step in what's happening today is a lot of audience indexing. Not necessarily guaranteeing impressions or even projecting impressions, but at least getting a better understanding based on all the viewing across the dial. What are the best network and inventory options based on a custom target? And that relates to what is also known as a TRP, a targeted rating point, which is kind of a hybrid of a GRP. It's just against a target audience. In that case, it's a slight variation of the GRP versus something that we find ourselves more often working with, which is household level impression data, and being able to really project that out. Our partner in getting started was Charter, so we've onboarded 10 million plus households of Charter data. And in those markets where they operate, they have a very stable basis to be able to project impression delivery. So using audience index to pick network rankers, but then using impression data, household level impression data to kind of fine tune based on the different attributes. Since viewing changes, week in and week out. And then in terms of the currency, what we found is this movement towards effective CPM. So rather than just looking at the total impressions, basically figuring out cost based on only those impressions that I'm really interested in reaching. Addressable does this inherently because ultimately you're only buying the audiences that you're addressing. But we're also seeing now with the data, census level data, can also provide impression level measurement for just a regular linear schedule. And I'm actually going to give you some examples of that. And then in terms of conversion and attribution, we talk a lot about sales attribution, but to the points earlier, brand attribution is just as important. Walmart is a large client of ours, and we spend just as much time using big data sets to measure brand attribution, brand perception, and brand improvement as we do sales attribution. And I can tell you those windows of research are far more extended on the brand side of it because the brand impact of TV can happen months later. And I think we got to be careful not to get caught up in looking at this real tight window of time to measure sales when the real impact of TV happens over months, in some cases years. And being able to study that using the data is just as important. So to bring this a little more to life, I thought I'd pull a couple of examples of work we did. One, if you kind of squint, looks like a buyer's planning grid. Which generally is like this massive spreadsheet with all these spots and dots and things like that. So for most of the buyers or planners, this stuff doesn't look too foreign, but the actual metrics within the plan are far different. In this case, what we did was we took all of the A&E viewership across 5 networks, all their 5 networks, and we basically ranked them based on about 500 or so attributes. So what this means is we took household level viewership data and we directly matched against about 500 attributes that included really expanded demographic attributes and a few hundred transactional attributes, shopping attributes. And then we just basically did top level rankers for each of the networks. And what the heat map shows is basically those audience attributes that indexed high across multiple A&E networks. So ultimately, they wanted to understand what makes the A&E audience unique across all networks, and then what were the types of attributes where each of the networks delivered uniquely. And what was really interesting was, you take Viceland, which in some markets isn't even rated. It's too small to measure. So, when you're talking about a niche network like that, it's really challenging to sell if you're selling on an age and gender basis. And yet what was interesting is that some of the most valuable audience attributes indexed really high for Viceland. So this, in essence, gives the ad sales team really good information about what advertisers should we be aligning against them. And one of the other things that was really interesting is that the top indexing shopping attribute for Lifetime, which is a women's network in the States, was men's apparel online, which, obviously kind of, when you think about it, makes common sense, like who's really buying all the clothes in the household. But it was interesting. It wouldn't be one of those categories they'd necessarily be going out and trying to sell, and yet it over-indexed. It was actually the single top shopping category. The other example I want to show you is actually a byproduct of our partnership with Charter. The data, I think one of the challenges is there is a massive amount of data, and it can be paralyzing. And the real key is, how do you distill it down into really actionable insights? And in the case of advertising, whether you're on the buy side or the sell side, how do you activate against this new data set? So rather than talk at a high level about this, I actually want to show you an application that we built, which took about a year in terms of onboarding and normalizing the data. And then also, it's not just the viewership data. In the case of Charter, which has 80 plus markets, within each market, they could have 30 ad zones. That translates to over 1,000 inventory feeds, in terms of the networks that they're selling on a local level. So it was onboarding all the data, both inventory data, the rates information, as well as the viewership data. And the whole design was to give the 1,200 sales reps that are in the marketplace a tool that could use their own audience data to sell custom targets. So, and this is a live demo. So despite everyone's recommendation not to do a live demo, I'm going to do a live demo. But we'll pick a market here, which is, right now we've got about 8 markets lit up. By early next year, we'll be in 60 plus markets, and by mid part of the year, we're looking at getting into 80 markets. So I'll pick Austin, and here there's a couple of ad zones. I'll say Austin South and West, and you see a little heat map. And the first thing we did was just to give the salespeople some insight into what are the top indexing attributes for Austin South, which again is a very small pocket of geography within Austin, and it basically floats like the top 5 indexing attributes. In this case, looks like auto propensity is that Kia? No, Lexus. Lexus SUV. An adjacent market, literally right next to it, is Dodge and truck. So what this says is just that when it comes to the brand of vehicle or the category of vehicle, what are the top indexing in those particular geographies? So here are 2 really tight geographies that you would think would have some things in common that are very different. And in terms of selling on a local level, that's really important. So we'll go forward, we'll say, okay, those are the 2 markets that we'd like to run advertising in. The next step basically is just to pick the audience attributes. And in the case of the application, we've appended to about 350 custom attributes, some of which are expanded demos, income, ethnicity. Some are political, since political advertising's really popular on a local level. And then in terms of purchasing data, we just rolled these up into larger categories. So whether it's beauty care, DIY, et cetera. And I'll go auto just because we're in Texas. Truck ownership in Texas is pretty high, so we'll pick trucks. And what happens is when you select the attribute, it calculates what percentage of the audience in those markets indexed against auto ownership. So basically what this is saying is 33% of the households within those 2 markets own a truck, which is a pretty sizable audience to go after. But that's not enough. Let's go one step further. In this case, let's go after households that own a truck that are also in the market for a truck. And this is using in-market data. We use both Polk and Experian. And here you can see it drop down to 8%. But again, because this is an optimization tool, it's designed to optimize the reach of the schedule against that audience. So it's not addressable. It's not like you're only going after those 8%. So before you get to a plan, for those that want to understand what does the schedule look like, you can actually hit run a report, and it'll generate, in essence, a custom index report against those attributes. So those 2 markets households in market for a truck that actually own a truck, and you see a network index report. And this is like the first step in kind of, generating an aha moment with a client, because in most cases, what a client's running is no reflection of these networks. There may be one or two networks that are in common, but it's the first time that they can actually see what an optimized schedule looks like. And then from here, we can actually go back and we can plan the schedule. So we'll just go ahead and finish up, put in a budget. In this case, it's a local campaign, so we'll say $5,000. And in this case, we'll run it over 3 weeks, and I'm kind of doing a long version. You can actually get through this more quickly. You also can set up network exceptions. So most of the salespeople were really having a problem with this. They're like, well, can you put the networks on the front of the process? And that's where you get into this, this change in approach, that usually they select the networks and then they run a schedule. In this case, you let the tool and the data really drive you to the schedule. So this was a little bit of a foreign concept. We can also filter by category too, if an advertiser doesn't want to run on kids' networks and so forth. So I'll just run a proposal, and what this is doing is it's pulling all of the audience data, filtering it based on those attributes that we've selected, and then bumping it up against the inventory to see the most efficient schedule that could be run against that particular household. In the past, even 2 years ago, this would probably take about 45 minutes to run. Today, because of AWS and the processing power, you can actually run it in that case, it was probably less than 10 seconds. And on the left are these little flip cards. We call them flip cards because we have cheat sheets underneath for those TV salespeople that don't know what a CPM is, and believe me, they're out there because they historically haven't been selling on a CPM basis, or for clients, we've got these little flip cards that give like a definition of that. But the first thing that pops up is just a representation of day parts. So based on the schedule, here's the day part mix. And that's really done just so to kind of dispel the myth that optimization means running everything in overnight. Since a lot of clients, that have been through this think, I keep hearing that's the most efficient place to be. In this case, there are other efficient options. And then for those that actually want to get into the network detail, it's fully transparent. So in this case, there's probably 15 networks here. In Austin, Nielsen measures probably like 20 or 30 of the top networks in that market. There's about 80 ad-supported networks. So a good 30-40% of these networks aren't even rated. So being able to put together a schedule that's based on the census level data will drive buyers and advertisers to the most relevant network, regardless of whether it's rated in the conventional system or not. And just for those that want to kind of pivot, you can see how the most number of spots don't necessarily generate the most number of impressions. It's kind of, that's common sense, but to actually see how it re-ranks based on those is another one of these things that, advertisers in some case feel like they have to be on a certain network and they have to run a certain number of spots. But when they're able to see the actual impressions that are delivered, kind of changes the whole decision making. And then from here, if the schedule looks good, you can actually save it. And what it does is it generates a strata file that can be ingested directly into trafficking. In the case of Charter, there's one last check. They goes through a planner just to make sure that the schedule looks good, and then they'll push go, and it can go right into trafficking. But in a lot of times, there could be latency between when this is presented and when someone would actually buy the schedule. So it's an example of kind of how data can be used. And again, this isn't about replacing the currency. It's really about just making the data actionable and more effective, because ultimately the punchline comes when you're measuring the effect of these impressions against sales or against brand lift or whatever the metrics are, which is kind of the second part of the story, which hopefully we'll have something to show you next year on that. So that's it.